My name's Adam McLaughlin, and this is the Church Marketing Ideas Podcast. Practical ideas to help your church build trust in your community. Welcome to the Church Marketing Ideas Podcast, episode 7. Today we're chatting with Rich Birch, and he's going to be talking about all kinds of things, but specifically in line with his book, The Church Growth Flywheel. So you can get all those notes at churchmarketingideas.com/007, churchmarketingideas.com/007. And a reminder, if you love hearing the Church Marketing Ideas podcast, then make sure you subscribe so you get all the new updates every time we launch a new podcast. And also leave us a review on iTunes. That helps more people find us and more people can learn how to impact their community through the Church Marketing Ideas podcast. At the end of the podcast today, we have a question about whether your church should be using a Facebook page or a Facebook group or both. And if it's both, how do you use both? So that question will be coming up right after my interview with Rich Birch. Rich is one of the early multi-site church pioneers in North America. He led the charge in helping the Meeting House in Toronto to become the leading multi-site church in Canada. In addition, he served on the leadership team of Connexus Church in Ontario, which is a North Point Community Church strategic partner. He's also been part of the lead team at Liquid Church, a 6-location multi-site church serving the Manhattan-facing suburbs of New Jersey. Liquid is known for its innovative approach to outreach and community impact. Rich is passionate about helping churches reach more people more quickly through excellent execution. He has a weekly blog and podcast that helps with stuff you wish they taught in seminary called unseminary.com. His latest best-selling book is Church Growth Flywheel, 5 practical systems to drive growth at your church. It's an Amazon bestseller in the church leadership category, and he lives with his wife, Christine, and his two teenagers in central Ontario, Canada. After a word from our sponsors, my interview with Rich Birch.
Hey friends on the Church Marketing Ideas podcast and any friends of Adam who are listening to this or watching this, I'm Neil Smith. I'm a consultant, author, speaker. I do all kinds of things. I was a pastor for many years. Social media pastor actually was my job title. And I've been living in the world of social media for many years. I actually wrote a book called Social Media Guide for Ministry about 8 years ago. And I had somebody email me the other day saying, I just got your book. I can't wait to read it. And I was like, don't read the book. It's 8 years old. Social media has changed so much in 8 years. And I wanted to create resources, and I've been creating resources to help churches. I believe, though, I've just created the best resource to help churches grow with social media. And I'm talking about grow numerically and spiritually. So I want you to check it out. It's a free resource. There's 3 training videos. We're going to have Facebook comments and learn and grow together. So go to churchmarketingideas.com/grow, churchmarketingideas.com/grow, and go check out this resource. Sign up, get the free resource, and engage in the conversation. Let's start growing your church together using social media.
Hey, Rich, thank you so much for hanging out with me today.
Adam, so glad to be getting a chance to connect again. It's been a while since we've talked, and just so glad that we get to spend a few minutes together today.
Yeah, for sure. And both of us are in beautiful Ontario, Canada.
Yeah, you know what? I meant to say this before we started recording, but there's a funny thing with Canadian church, or with church leaders who are also in Canada. Like, there's you, there's me, there's Brady Shearer, there's the CG, the church motions guys, Jeff Karen Newhoff, and Danielle Strickland. There's a bit of but we're all within batting distance of each other for some strange reason.
Yeah, we are, and it is really interesting. And then also, I've had this conversation actually a few times with a few people. There's a lot of incognito Canadians who live somewhere in the States who are very influential in our space as well. So it's kind of cool.
Yes. Yeah, it's very good.
We won't point them out. We need to keep their identity.
No, that's part of their pact.
Undercover.
Exactly.
Hey, dude, I'm so excited to be talking about your book, The Church Growth Flywheel. And I know when did it come out exactly?
So yeah, this book's been out for 2 years now. And yeah, super proud of it. And, it really came out of this desire. The Liquid Church, the church I was a part of, had been named one of the fastest growing churches. What is it that God's using? And so, and also is a little bit of a bugaboo, which might get into, about some of the stuff about church growth that just bugs me that people kind of talk about online. And so in some ways it's a reaction against, frankly, I see some negative stuff out there online. So it's kind of those two things came together, and I was like, oh, I'd love to kind of put this together in a book.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm typically when we're interviewing somebody for a podcast, we're talking about the newest book that's launched or a book that's about to launch. But I'm excited to chat with you about a book that's been out for a couple of years, because one of the things I want to ask about is the feedback that you've gotten from different people about the church growth flywheel system. But before we get there, I'd like to dig in a little bit to actually what the content of the book is, the meat of the book. So start with just explaining what is a flywheel.
Great. So I don't know if you, when you were a kid, if at the park by you, they had these things. In our neighborhood, they called them merry-go-rounds, and they called different things across the country. What they were was a large flat metal disc, like really, really heavy. And then it had usually had 4 posts on it, and it was kind of spinning on an axis. And what you would do is you'd put 1 foot on the disc and then 1 foot on the ground, and you'd push that first time around, and it was almost impossible to push it the first time. And then the second time was a little less, a little less work. And then the third time, a little less and a little less and a little less. And finally, what would happen is you would go from pushing hard to hardly pushing. Well, that's a flywheel. It's this idea that if we kind of apply effort in a consistent direction over a period of time, that effort gains momentum. And I think that's kind of the core thesis of the book, that there isn't anything, there's not one silver bullet around church growth. It's really a series of things that if we do together consistently over time, we'll see some impact and some results.
Rich, I know that Church Growth Flywheel is the final title of the book, but you were going to call it something else. What were you considering calling that book?
That's a good question. So I originally was going to call the book 1,000 Days to a Bigger Church, which no one would buy that book because they don't want to wait 1,000 days. Now, maybe the people who are the considered great leaders who are listening to this podcast would, because they know that there's no instantaneous results. But most people are looking for some sort of fast, kind of results. And so the big idea is really this idea of a flywheel. That's really what it's all about.
Yeah, and I love it. And you've broken down into 5 systems that a church needs in order to sustain growth and create growth. And I know that you've been a part of a few significant growth churches. So just give us a little bit of a bio so we know where this information is coming from. Then we're going to dig into a few topics in the book.
Yeah. So a part of what's weird about my background, which when you live your own experience, it's your own experience. And so you don't really ever think it's strange. It's kind of your life. But then I realized, kind of as I was putting this book together and kind of in the year before that my own background was a little bit unique. So I've been a part of 3 different churches over the last 20 years that all 3 of them have grown from less than 1,000 to, a few thousand to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people, and have been a part of the kind of core leadership of that team. So a couple of these churches people might have heard of. The Meeting House in Toronto, people probably haven't heard of that church before. It's a multisite church. So they're I think 22 campuses now all throughout the kind of greater Toronto area. And then the 2 they might have heard of, one is Connexus Church, which is another Canadian church north of Toronto, probably because of Carrie Newhoff, the founding and teaching pastor, and then Liquid Church, which was the most recent church that I've been served in, and it's in New Jersey, so the Manhattan-facing suburbs of New Jersey. Tim Lucas is the lead pastor there.
Yeah, and so this is like hands-on practical experience. This isn't something that you observed at somebody else's church or you saw could be happening. And are all 5 of the pieces of the church growth flywheel completely integral? Like we need all 5 pieces to make this work?
Oh, great question. So I think they are. One of the things that I did with this book was I was really trying to look not only at our own experience, the things that I've seen front row, but really trying to draw from other churches' experience and really trying to let the data drive it and just say, okay, what are those things that we see common? And so I also run a podcast called On Seminary, and kind of the the dirty secret of that is I don't know, I think we're 400 or 500 episodes in, and most of those are interviews with executive pastors of some of the fastest growing churches in the country. And so it's literally, I've had hundreds of hours of conversations with executive pastors in fast growing churches. And so really what I noticed was, hey, the things that God seemed to be using in my own experience are the things that he seems to be using in other churches as well. And so these 5, I do think that they're critical for all churches. And there's some of them. In fact, there's one of them that I see churches ignore. Even my own church, we ignore. And I'm like, just missed opportunity. So absolutely. I think they're all important. I think they work together. I think there is a cumulative effect back to the flywheel. They kind of feed on each other. And over time, you kind of see the impact of all of them together.
Right. So we're going to talk about the 5 pieces of the church growth flywheel. And for our listeners, some of you might recognize that you have some of these pieces in place. And so really would encourage you to pick up Rich's book and learn about the other pieces of that puzzle. So all 5 of these pieces are working for your church to build trust and impact your community. So the first piece, Rich, or the first part of the flywheel is that big days are a big deal. So talk to me a little bit about what qualifies as a big day.
So your church has 3 or 4 days every year where 2 things happen. One, your people are more likely to invite their friends, and their friends are more likely to attend. That's just true. This is one of those things that you can, in fact, for years, I resisted this. I was like, no, every Sunday is a perfect Sunday to invite people to our church. But you know what? Actually, there are a few Sundays a year where your people are more likely to do this. And one of the things that we come back to time and again in the church growth flywheel is that really the difference between fast growing churches or just growing churches and churches that aren't growing is growing churches have figured out how to drive invitability. That is really the key. At the end of the day, your church will grow when your people tell their friends about it. And so big days are a big deal because your people are more likely to tell their friends about what's going on in the church. And so some of these are obvious. Christmas and Easter, you typically see those. Again, we could get into the nuance of all this, but those are 2 big days. Really, to me, the interesting ones are the 3rd and 4th. And so that could be, in some churches, it's Mother's Day. I know for years at Liquid, Mother's Day wasn't one of them, partly because one of our slogans we used to say all the time is, we ain't your mama's church. And so mom doesn't come to your church on Mother's Day when you say we ain't your mama's church. But a lot of churches do see Mother's Day. Another one that's kind of funny is the time change Sunday in the fall, particularly people get an extra hour sleep. In fact, actually this past year when we went through that time change, I had a church that I've been doing some coaching with. They texted me and they were like, man, it was our biggest day biggest non-holiday day ever. And they had done some stuff that we had talked about in the big days are big deal. They kind of built around that day. And we were, lamenting a little bit because it's a little bit humbling that you're telling me, okay, so if people just get an extra hour of sleep, they'll come. But we talk in the book about a bunch of things you should do around those big days to kind of make them 2 things, make them more invitable, and then ensure that your people are fully aware that they should be inviting their friends. It's kind of both sides of those equations.
Yeah. So one of the things that we experienced at the church that I served at, or one of the churches that I served at, was September, or whenever school season starts, seemed to be everybody was coming back from vacation, right? And so everybody's kind of resetting their year and get back into their rhythm, and church is one of those things. And the other one that we found specifically at the church that I served at in the United States was Super Bowl Sunday, because
Absolutely.
You were no longer doing playoff games that could interfere with service times, because Super Bowl Sunday's later in the day, right? So everybody's used to having to work around playoff times, and then they don't have to on Super Bowl Sunday. So that was always a big day and a big deal.
That's a great one. Super Bowl Sunday is an interesting one, and there's a real growing, and people have been leveraging Super Bowl Sunday for a long time, but the Football Sunday guys have been doing a good job around actually taking this idea of let's actually leverage that. Because what you're seeing, and this is what I encourage in the book, is just let the data drive what the 3 or 4 Sundays are a year. Look back over however long you've got, 5 years, 10 years data, figure out what do we have historically. And there is usually the 3rd or 4th is usually a surprise like that. And there's usually somewhere in there one that you're like, oh, why is it that the third week in January is always our biggest, is always our third biggest day of the year. And then you dig back in and figure out, well, it's because our senior pastor always takes the first 2 weeks of the year off, and then he always starts a new series on that. And that seems to be combining with the New Year, New You thing. And so, yeah, there is. And then, so the question becomes, okay, we know that those seem to be big days. So then what are we doing to kind of build a strategy around that?
Right. And one thing before we get into the next piece is that I think we really need to define growth. And one of the interesting things that you talk about in your masterclass is 94% of churches, even ones that are, by the books, seeing more numbers, are actually not outpacing the growth of their communities. So tell me a bit about how do we measure those things so that we actually find out if community growth is by fault growing our church or if we're actually gaining momentum.
Yeah, so a dirty secret of the church growth movement is that, back in the 80s and 90s, and it's still really prevalent today in kind of the church planting movement particularly, we would deliberately put churches in fast growing communities. So communities that, if your community in the next 10 years is going to grow. I have a friend of mine who, there's literally 10,000 homes being built about 2 miles from his church.
Wow.
Like, that's a huge opportunity, right? Like that, if they don't grow, something's going wrong. But the problem with this, so you quoted this stat, 94% of all churches in, this is an American statistic in the States, are not growing as quickly as the communities they serve. So the problem, usually you hear the more encouraging statistic that 85% of churches are plateaued or in decline, but it's actually far worse than that. More than 50% of churches that are growing aren't growing as quickly as their community. So, you can go and find those statistics. In fact, even if you just Wikipedia your town or your county, that's actually a really standard statistic that lots of places track. It drives all kinds of economic behavior. And so the question for you is that's the baseline growth target your church needs to have. If your church is not outpacing the growth of the community they're in, then you're doing something wrong. Over time, the message of Jesus will lose its influence in communities if all of our churches together aren't growing as quickly as the communities are in. And so we're seeing that. So between 1990 and 2050, the absolute attendance in the church is pegged to be in half. Now, if we don't see a turnaround in that's kind of where the trend is going, while during that same time, the population will double. So actually, we'll look at our churches and feel like, well, it's not that big a deal. We went from a church of 300 to a church of 150. The problem with that is the communities around us doubled in that same time.
Right.
And I think too often we peg our growth in year over year against ourselves rather than against the communities we're in. And that's a problem. That's a kind of a big P problem for the church in general. We've got to keep our eye on.
Yeah, and the comparison trap that we talk about, and not getting obsessed with the comparison trap. What I would encourage churches and everybody who's listening to consider, don't peg your growth compared to the next church down the street, but you do need to understand the growth of your community and if your growth is actually making progress. So before you think to yourself, hey, we're a growing church, so maybe we'll glaze over this book. No. You still need to be reading those numbers and finding out if how this book can help you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that. That's like awfully kind of you to say. I've ended up doing a lot of coaching over the years with churches that are trying to kind of, it's a super small target, churches that are trying to get over 2,000, which I realize for most people that are listening in are like thinking, wow, it'd be amazing to get to that day. But that's an interesting psychological mindset kind of barrier to get over, I found in churches. And actually a part of what it is I find is actually this issue, because what some complacency can fit in. Your church gets to 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 people. You've got everything that you need. Like, you can pay all the bills. You can do the big Christmas thing. You can convince yourself, you can like fund a bunch of mission stuff. Your student ministry has enough money for fireworks and their events, and you get to this point where you actually feel a little bit complacent. You're like, oh, like it's fine. Everything is fine. But actually I find, particularly if church at that size has started to slow, a part of getting them to think more clearly is, hey, like for you just to grow at the same rate of your community, like that's actually in most cases a fairly aggressive growth pattern. You've got to actually think strategically about how are we going to ultimately drive your people to invite more friends.
Right. And then the next piece of that is leveraging series rollout. So tell us a little bit about why that can correlate directly to church growth.
So this is the part of the church growth flywheel that we've seen has the kind of greatest impact. And so if you're going to get the book, you literally, if you just jumped to page 79 and read this and started with this, what we seem to be seeing is this is the part that you'd asked about what impact have we seen. This one seems to be the one that we see having the kind of biggest impact. Really, so most churches, not all churches, I realize, but most churches that I seem to interact with and that would read a book like this, they've packaged their teaching up into series. And what is a series for people that don't know? A series is really just a way to help people understand the content that we're presenting. So, and obviously we're trying to present the entire, Bible. We're trying to present the entire, counsel of Scripture, but you don't typically just preach from Genesis to Revelation, Genesis to Revelation. Now, I know there's some churches that do that, but most churches aren't doing that. They're finding some way to kind of break it down, even if they're saying, hey, we're going to do a series, on the book of John for the next 12 weeks or for the next 20 weeks, they're still finding a way to break it down. Now, what we're finding is churches that are growing use the change from series to series. They use that as a way to encourage their people to invite new friends. It's really I like to call it the Netflix effect. So, or maybe the Disney Plus effect would be a more apropos example. When you scroll through Netflix, have you ever found yourself doing this? You scroll through Netflix and you're looking for something, but you spend 45 minutes just scrolling through Netflix. Yeah. And you're looking and you're like, well, maybe this or maybe that. Why are you doing that? Because the human mind is built to not want to just know what's on, but you want to know what else is on, what's coming up next. And so series, too many churches, I think, go from series to series and they don't really talk about what's coming up next. They just kind of stop one thing and start the next. So what we talk about in this chapter is really break down, here are some things you should be doing. There's 8 things that we talk about that are, that I think are critical for every church to do, that really help the church really get out in front of people and promote the next series. Again, I think this is critically important. And you could see it's really at the heart of the flywheel because churches that have seen kind of this pay dividends, they really see it a year or 2 years later. They look back and say, oh, now I see the impact of that over time. And it was really this that got me thinking about Flywheel at Liquid. One of the things I would say that was different about us in the years leading up to us being tagged as one of the fastest growing churches in the country is 30 series before. So 3 years before, we had said, no, these are the 8 things we're going to do every time we launch a new series, and we're going to do it every time. And we're not going to debate, is this the one we're going to do invite cards for or not? We're going to make invite cards every time. Or are we going to do a video? Are we going to do social media? Are we going to, no, we're going to do those things every single time. That we're just going to spend our creative energy on thinking, no, we're not going to debate what we're doing. We're just going to go ahead. No, we're going to go and do it every time. So yeah, this is really is the heart of, or I would say the nub, the core of the Church Growth Flywheel is this chapter.
And one of the ways to roll out a series is obviously social media. But not only is it one of the ways to roll out a series, but it's also one of the pieces of the flywheel. So tell me a little bit about how that integrates specifically or the way to use social media specifically to see growth.
Yeah, great question. So we all know, and particularly people who are reading or listening to this podcast, this chapter or this part where we're talking about social media, there are people that are listening in that are like, duh, of course social media is important. But again, talking to most church leaders, there are still a lot of people who aren't sure whether, they should be on Facebook or not. Like, I read a statistic that 1 in 4 churches do not have a website, which is shocking to me, let alone, so I think sometimes there's a little bit of an echo chamber. We can get in these circles and be thinking about like, well, should your church be on TikTok? And we're talking about like, what's the latest TikTok strategy? Where actually most churches aren't, like, they're nowhere near that. And so I think social media is critically important. The way I talk about it in the book is, imagine in your town if there was something that 60% of the people in your town did this week. So like, we're recording this just before there's a big parade coming up in my town this coming weekend. And nowhere near 60% of my town is going to go to this parade. But imagine if 60% of our town was going to be standing on the sidelines of that parade. As a church leader, I would be thinking, how do I get something in the parade? Because, 60% of our people are there. Now, the difference with social media, specifically that stat is Facebook, 60% of American adults are on Facebook daily. Think about that. If 60% of the people in your town were not just doing something every week, but they were doing it every day, you would think after a few days, you would be like, maybe we should go do something over there. Right. Or maybe we should at least go check it out. But that's really what's happening on social media. And again, so there's a whole thing there around how do we be helpful on social media. I think there are a lot of churches that are kind of doing this wrong, and what they're doing is they're just putting up advertisements. They're just saying, come to our church, come to our church, come to our church, which again, no one is going to share a graphic or any kind of post, a video that just says, come to our church. What you want to do is share content that your people are more likely to share. They're likely to use in the inviting process. And so I use some examples in there. Example I used from one of the churches I was a part of, the Meeting House, which they did this long after I was there. The Bruxy KB, who's the lead teaching pastor there, is a great guy. And a core part of what he does is every Sunday at the end of his talks, he does an open forum Q&A. He does this every single week. Every time he teaches, he does hey, if anybody any questions about anything I said or left unsaid, Q&A. As you can imagine, it's kind of the emotional center of the talks. Like, people are drawn in by that. Yes, if you're wondering, and they're unfiltered. It's just like, hey, you over there, what do you think? And yeah, crazy people ask questions sometimes. But he has a really good skill at that. So they figured out a way to kind of package that. They do this thing called BBQ, Bruxy's Bag of Questions, where every week, or maybe it's every 10 days, they release these little videos where they're 3 minutes long, and they tackle a kind of an up-to-date question, something that people should be thinking about. Should Christians be smoking marijuana? Or, and then they'll do stuff about scripture. Or they do all different types of topics that, at the time when I wrote the book, which again, this is 2 years ago, I think they had done maybe 70 of those videos, and they were pushing over 100,000 views. For a single church, that's pretty amazing. Like, that's huge views. But again, the key to it is they're trying to be helpful, and they're being consistent. They're getting out in front of it all the time. And so I think there's a lot that could be said about social media. Again, I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit with this kind of podcast, but maybe, another way to think about it is, maybe if you're a church communications person and you are wondering about your TikTok strategy is, and your senior pastor or your lead pastor is thinking, I don't want to do anything on there, give them this book or say, hey, suggest that they maybe read it, because that's really who it's targeted at. And there's a whole conversation there around, really us leveraging or encouraging pastors to leverage their own social media feeds rather than really just looking at, the church's feed. There's a little bit of and this is a whole tangent, but, if your pastor isn't sharing what you're making at the church, like if you're a church communications person and you're developing content for any stream, Facebook, let's say, as an example, and they're not liking, commenting, and sharing on what you're doing, you should probably ask whether you're doing the right thing. Because if the pastor at your church isn't excited to share what you're making, then you're probably not making the right stuff. And so again, shareability is a huge issue. Try to be helpful. Try to make content that people will actually share and use it as an invite tool. Don't try to impress people. Stop trying to make stuff viral. That isn't the goal. There's a few things.
So I know that one of the keys to social media and one of the keys to get more exposure on social media is to be engaging and create engaging kinds of content. And one of the pieces of the church growth flywheel is community engagement. So tell me a little bit about how those two pieces work together, as far as people in your community are on social media and you're engaging with them there, versus other forms of community engagement, and how those pieces function together.
Great question. So, it's interesting. This part of, if I was to redo the book, this will end up becoming a part of the conversation, because what is interesting to me as we continue to watch these trends is there's some interesting feedback loops that happen in all of these areas. And, increasingly, everywhere I go, I see growing organizations. The shorthand I would like to say it is, it's like they're working from Instagram backwards. They're working from how do we make an experience that people are more likely to share on Instagram, and then how do we then kind of roll that out? Last fall, I went and visited. I'm a bit of a Star Wars fan. I'm a huge Disney fan. I went and visited the new Star Wars land called Galaxy's Edge, and so it's rumored to be $1 billion investment on both coasts. So they spent $2 billion in North America on these things. The thing that struck me as I was walking around was like, oh, this is just a series of photo backdrops. These are places where people can stand and get their pictures taken, like stand in front of this and get their picture taken, stand in front of that and get their picture taken. That's what this thing is. So I'm going a long route to get back to your community engagement issue. We have to be thinking about our content from that kind of angle. How are people going to use this content? How are they going to share this? What are they going to do? How are we including people in the conversation? Most recently, or just recently, Carrie Newhoff, again, a friend of mine and a guy I used to work for, he was doing a series recently on, so the series was called What Happens When You Die, and it was based around this idea that actually one of the most searched phrases on Google is what happens when you die. I mean, you know that. And so people are out there, and you can actually find the statistic relevance of that using Google Trends in your community. There's a ton of people who are searching that. And so it was like a series on what happens when you die and heaven and hell. And like, it's like old school preaching stuff, but kind of wrapped in this interesting, really cool frame. But a part of what he did was he's what everybody has done, which is, hey, we want to take your questions. But what they did was they leveraged Instagram to take the questions, and then they feed back all those questions publicly. So he's up on Sunday saying, send us your questions. The way we're going to take your questions is through Instagram. Gave like a 30-second, this is how you use Instagram lesson. People go, and then they're posting all those back. Now, what a great kind of responsive, and there's crazy stuff in there. There is the like, do all dogs go to heaven? What about cats? Like, there's like some combative stuff in there. Again, that draws people in. Do we have the risk to be engaged in a kind of dialogue with our people rather than seeing social media as a one-way communication? It really should be two-way. It's about how do we engage. And then outside of all of that, and this actually is one of the aspects of the Church Growth Flywheel, we talk about, just because this idea of moving people out of their seats and into the streets. And one of the things that really struck me was, and I keep seeing this time and again, fast-growing churches aren't content with just having people come to their church and sit and just take in. What they're trying to do is mobilize their people to get out of their seats and into the streets, to actually go and do something, to kind of make a difference. And we see this in all different ways. This is the church that, is at Thanksgiving. We just went through, American Thanksgiving there late last year. And, there are churches that are doing like huge turkey giveaways where they're like, we're going to give away 1,000 turkeys to people this Christmas or this Thanksgiving, or it's the community cleanups in the spring, or it's the, at Liquid, we did these all the time. It was the 5K for clean water, or it's the, we're going to do an extreme home makeover. We're going to go to a battered women's shelter and redo it in 24 hours. It's that kind of thing. Now, interestingly, those are the right things to do. We think they're the God thing. We think it's like God calls us to do that. He's called us to make a difference. He's called us to, to care for the poor in our communities. We think it's a good thing. We think it's a God thing to do, but our community sees it as a good thing to do. And it relates to social media in this. You put t-shirts on everybody and have some fun moments in that, I guarantee you people in your church are going to stop. They're going to take a picture of themselves and some friends from church sharing and doing this, and they're going to share it on Facebook because people want to be seen as that kind of person. Now, do you think that makes a difference in the growth of your church? Absolutely. It's this interesting nexus of it's not only the right thing to do, but because your people will share it, it then ends up fueling church growth. And social media is the kind of the plane upon which that flies. It's kind of like the backbone of how that happens. That's why are every one of those things built with like, okay, you're going to get a free t-shirt, Like, is it because you want a free t-shirt? Well, some people like free t-shirts, but it's also because frankly, it makes a great picture. It like looks really great. Although it's not just people cleaning a park, it's everyone from our church cleaning a park. It's, it's the Jeff Henderson #4 stuff. The reason why that has so much momentum to it is because of this kind of core idea of how do we invite people, to how do we encourage our people to invite people. It's all that connected. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And, couple things we'll link to in the show notes. I know that Instagram story from Connexus Church, I've been watching it also, and I was wondering how they got so many answers to the questions. So I love the thought of, rather than just in service, handing out a mic and taking questions, although that's a great way to do it, actually using a social media channel that's publicly facilitated and is going to create organic reach to create some engagement in a live setting. That's a really great idea.
Yeah, and I think on that kind of Instagram thing, and I don't know, I'm not on that team, but in similar environments, I do know that a part of what we want to do is model for our people what we're looking for. And so in the great kind of execution on that is, sure, get 5 people who are volunteers of your church to go in and ask a question and then post their stuff right away. A part of the beauty of the way Instagram works is when you repost those questions, it's not telling you who posted them. So they could all be from the same person. Right. Now they aren't in that case, but you could have people in there kind of preceding, and then people will say, oh, wow, that is crazy. Somebody asked about dogs. I'm actually kind of concerned about that. And so I've got a different angle on the do dogs go to heaven question. And, here it is, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And so the last piece of the church growth flywheel is probably the one that most churches are hesitant to tackle and address. And that last piece is internal communication. And the reason is because we anticipate that we're going to go out and do a community event, and that's going to spread the word about our church. But internal communication, nobody outside our church sees that or sees they're probably going to see the symptoms or the results of that getting lined up, right? So Tell me about how that internal communication fosters growth.
So one of the things when you talk with church leaders of fast-growing churches, they reject the reach and keep dichotomy. They reject this idea of deep and wide. They aren't caught in this idea of like, we're just trying to get a whole bunch of people here, or the like, I'm just about growing disciples. They actually reject that dichotomy. It's like a false dichotomy. You can't be about just going out and doing all this kind of external stuff without also being concerned about internal. What are we doing when all these guests arrive? And so that's really struck me over the years that those two are not seen in fast-growing churches, are not seen as separate. Now, ironically, actually in churches that aren't growing, I think they are seen as separate. A lot of times their churches are struggle. They're like, well, we're going to really close that back door. We're really kind of a close the back door kind of church. We're not so concerned about the front door. And that sort of language is actually, we don't see it evident in as much in fast-growing churches. What they're saying is like, hey, we see a lot of guests coming. We want to do what we can to get those guests connected. We're trying to do both of those things at the same time. And so internal communication really is all about that. Primarily in the book and in the masterclass, we really talk about, okay, what do you do? What is the initial response when guests come to your church? Because it would be like a real shame to get a bunch of new guests to come to your church and then to fumble at that point, to say like, oh, like we didn't actually do anything with them. And so there are some common trends that we see on the communication front with fast-growing churches on the internal side. And particularly it's around kind of the new guest experience. So this idea of like, okay, when people arrive, are we offering them a gift in exchange for their contact information? What are we doing when we get their contact information? We're typically offering them to come to one connection sort of thing. It's some version. What we're seeing consistently is some version of Church of the Highlands growth track, where it's a consistent, once it's, it's Growth of the Highlands does it every week. So they have a 4-part thing they do every week of the month that rotates through, that although there are some churches doing that, a lot of churches are seeing at least doing something monthly or every other week, that sort of thing. So we're consistently, the idea is a guest comes and we're not saying, come back to our new members class, which launches next fall. It's saying, hey, next Sunday or 2 weeks from now, we've got this new here class that we would love to get you plugged in. And that is your best next step. And then we're going to send you a postcard. We're going to send you an email. Maybe we're going to call you. Maybe we're going to send someone over to your house with a cake. And all of those things point towards come to this next step, this one single next step. And really, if most churches could fix that piece, you would see growth. Like that it's not rocket science. It's like, you've got guests coming to your church today. How are you getting them to stick and stay? What are you, and typically it's because we're confusing them. We're saying, here are 8 different things you could do. Like, take this like Enneagram class, or maybe you want to take this Myers-Briggs thing, or get into a group, or join a team, or what we're doing mission trips next summer, or maybe you could like this other thing. And it's just too much. Like, you've got to actually reduce it down, simplify it, streamline it to this kind of one thing. And so we wrote about that in the book and talked about it in the masterclass, because that area is, I find, the highest leverage point. And I can tell you, again, for leaders that have listened this far in, they're about to get a nugget. So when churches call me and say, hey, we're looking for some help in the church growth area, I ask so we're nice and all that, tell me about your history and all that. But then really what we get to is that there's one number I want to know. And this is the number I say, okay, actually 2 numbers because they relate to each other. Tell me about what your average church attendance is, and tell me about how many first-time guests you had in this last year. So if a church says, oh, we're averaging 200 people, and they say, oh, and we've had, and they usually don't know it, first of all, most church leaders, and this is across the spectrum. This is church of 200. This is multiple thousand per person churches. Most people don't know these 2 numbers. They know the average attendance number. They don't know the first-time guest number, which is a bit ironic. I'm like, this whole thing, you're trying to grow and you don't know how many first-time guests you have. Obviously, I don't say that. I'm kind. And I'm like, well, why don't we try to look that number up? But let's say it's 200 and 200. So their churches average 200 a week, and they've seen 200 guests in the last year. We would see that as an average benchmark. If you can attain the total number of first-time guests over an entire year is the same as an average attendance on any given Sunday, then that you have enough first-time guests to grow your church. If you're ahead of that number, then you've got some sort of communication problem and you're not getting them streamlined in. You're not if you're not growing. If you have more than that number and you're not seeing growth, then there's a problem. We've got to work on this communication piece. If it's lower than that, let's say your church is 200 and you had 100 guests in the last year, then there's couple things. One, you could be doing a really bad job on the new here guest process. Like, you're actually not collecting the data well. And so then I would drill into that and try to figure out, okay, what's going on? And a lot of times there's problems there. It's like, well, we don't really have a process. We don't really tell people what to do. Or if they're doing that well and they're kind of following, some industry standards on that stuff, then I would say, oh, you've got a front door problem. Like, you literally have to work on all of this invite stuff. And then what can we do from there? And so that's a critical piece of the puzzle. And really it points, even just understanding that number for people who are listening in, if you understood those 2 numbers, that would give you a pathway to understand what should we be working on next? What area should we be concentrating on?
That's gold right there. So,
well, it's for the people that have been listening in.
Yeah, if you made it this long, that's your reward for hanging out with us.
Nice.
I'm glad you brought up the masterclass, because I love that you've coupled this book with a masterclass. And so tell me a little bit about the masterclass, and tell me what somebody will learn different than what they'll learn reading the book.
Great. So really, the Church Growth Flywheel Masterclass is the book, but presented in a video format. So it's a video class, but then it also it does two major differences. One is it reorders the book into what we're seeing as kind of the step-by-step do this, then do this, then do this, then do that. The book is presented more like a menu. Hey, here's 5 different things you could do. Try them and see what works. What we do with the masterclass is we get a little more pointed and are pushing more in like, okay, follow these steps through. But then it also it's more than, because we're constantly adding new content. So not only do you get the core content, but then we're doing video calls. We're trying to bring in, apply from other churches. People are learning and trying things. And then we're like, hey, let's do this. There's an interesting kind of conversation in today's conversation. We were talking about big days, and one of the things that I've been tracking is churches that make up big days. So they'll, like, a lot of times these are around actual things happening in the calendar. Mm-hmm. So like we've just said, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Christmas, Easter, even the back to school stuff, that all is kind of related to a certain day. What we're finding is there are a whole bunch of churches out there. So there's one church in Philadelphia called Epic Church. They've been doing this thing called Epic Day, which just happens to happen in late January, early February every year. And it's one of their biggest days of the year. And so we've got a call coming up where I pull on a church leader who it's unreal. They did a makeup big day last fall. And it literally was just a made up day in November. And they saw twice the attendance of the year before on that same Sunday. They doubled their year over year attendance. And so I'm like, hey, we need to learn more from you. Let's talk that through, what's actually happening there. And so what we're trying to do is add more content. And then, and then there's also, there's like a Facebook group and all this kind of stuff. So it's not just kind of stale content. Now, to be honest, you could buy the book and take that and be like, hey, that's great. It's a lower price point. It would give you what you need. And then really it's for churches that are saying, hey, we're serious about this. We want to take it to another level. Frankly, we're seeing a lot of churches when they go from like, maybe one church leader reads it and is like, oh, this is a good thing. And then they're like, no, I actually want to push this to my entire, whether it's elders board or staff team. And so then they'll buy the course because it has videos attached with it. And so then they use that in kind of a video training way. So that's really the difference between the two, trying really to provide a way for it to be as helpful as possible for folks.
Sure. And outside the Church Growth Masterclass, you have your podcast and you have your blog. So tell us how we can track you down, Rich. How can we learn more from you?
Yeah, so the best way is to just drop by our website, unseminary.com. So unseminary, why is it called that? It's not anti-seminary.com, it's unseminary.com. This idea that I'm really intrigued by this idea that the thing that is really pushing churches forward that are growing aren't things that they taught in seminary. And so they're really things that they don't teach in seminary. And so if you go to unseminary.com, you can track everything there. We've got a bunch of free resources, and actually on the church growth thing, we've got a free 3-part video series. You just poke around in there. You'll find everything you need.
Sounds good. Well, Rich, thank you so much for writing this book and helping churches understand the Church Growth Flywheel. And also, thank you so much for hanging out today.
So glad to be here, Adam. Thanks for everything you do to help church leaders.
Hey, friends on the Church Marketing Ideas podcast, and any friends of Adam who are listening to this or watching this. I'm Neil Smith. I'm a consultant, author, speaker. I do all kinds of things. I was a pastor for many years. Social media pastor actually was my job title. And I've been living in the world of social media for many years. I actually wrote a book called Social Media Guide for Ministry about 8 years ago. And I had somebody email me the other day saying, I just got your book. I can't wait to read it. And I was like, don't read the book. It's 8 years old. Social media has changed so much in 8 years. And I wanted to create resources, and I've been creating resources to help churches. I believe, though, I've just created the best resource to help churches grow with social media. Now, I'm talking about grow numerically and spiritually. So I want you to check it out. It's a free resource. There's 3 training videos. We're going to have Facebook comments and learn and grow together. So go to churchmarketingideas.com/grow, churchmarketingideas.com/grow, and go check out this resource. Sign up, get the free resource, and engage in the conversation. Let's start growing your church together using social media.
Hey, Adam, my question is about Facebook pages and Facebook groups. So could you explain the difference between those and give us some ideas about how to use each one for our church? Thanks so much.
Okay, the difference between Facebook pages and Facebook groups, it's kind of a bit of a different philosophy. A Facebook page is kind of like a billboard. It's where you can broadcast information. It's where you can put information. Yes, you're trying to create engagement. Yes, you're trying to ask questions and get engaging content. It's not just about promotion, but it is very outward facing. So think to yourself, before you put something on your Facebook page, what would somebody in my community want to hear from us? What is the kind of information that someone in my community might like to hear in order to decide if they would like to visit us on a Sunday or engage with an event or come to our concert or whatever the case might be? What is something that someone in our community can like our page and find out more about? So that's very outward facing. A Facebook group is very internal. So it might be like if you were at a small group, what kind of things would you talk about there that you wouldn't just go talking about publicly in your community? That could be something like, this family, somebody from this family was in the hospital. Can somebody take them a meal? Or somebody needs some clothing? Or, hey, does anybody have any great recipe ideas for, leftover XYZ? So it's very much conversational, internal. So something like, so-and-so is sick and we need extra hand to help in the nursery on Sunday. That would be perfect for your Facebook group of people who go to your church. Something like, you're invited to this event that we're putting on. That would be perfect for your Facebook page, where somebody in the community would receive the invite. Now, I think optimal strategy is to take your Facebook group and divide them into subgroups, or have multiple Facebook groups that reach different people. Maybe a Facebook group for parents of teenagers, and a Facebook group for parents of the kids in your church, and a Facebook group for singles, and a Facebook group for people who are retired, and a Facebook group for stay-at-home moms, and a Facebook group for, basically, if you have a small group in your church in any form, your worship team is a small group, your youth leaders are a small group, your production team is a small group, your prayer group is a small group. Any of those potential small groups allows you to get the best message to the person who needs to hear it. So a group that has parents of teenagers is a great place to talk about the upcoming missions trip or answer any questions they have about a fundraising event. Whereas a group for retired people, you wouldn't put the youth information in there, but they might have their own conversations, their own events, or their own just things that matter to them that don't necessarily translate across different demographics. So that's the difference between a Facebook page and a Facebook group. A Facebook page is for broadcasting into your community. Anybody who wants to can like your Facebook page and find out what's going on there. A Facebook group is more internal, and the best interaction is when you can build kind of micro communities through Facebook groups to allow people to interact with others that are in the same stage of life they're at. Now, if you have a question, you can go to churchmarketingideas.com and click the button that says Ask a Question. We promise we'll answer every single question that comes in, and a few of them we'll select to be on the podcast. Coming up on the next episode.
I'm a media guy, and my co-writer, Jonathan Bach, is a media guy. He's a marketing expert and here in Hollywood. And we always think of things in terms of branding or marketing perspective. So we've always been, Christianity's losing such influence in the culture. Why are we being dismissed? A few years ago, we were really criticized heavily. Today, we're virtually ignored. And so it's just interesting that we're almost at the point where we have no influence in the culture at all. And I looked over the last 30 or 40 years of how we've tried to engage the culture. And really, I couldn't find a single strategy that's moved the dial in a positive direction in any area. We tried boycotts. We tried, if your employees didn't say Merry Christmas and said Happy Holidays, we're going to not buy your coffee. Well, that didn't make much of an impact. Right. We tried to boycott one major denomination here in America, boycotted Walt Disney Studios for about 7 years. And problem was, during that 7 years, Disney's their profits went through the roof. So it did the exact opposite of what this denomination thought it would do. And so we tried these really dumb things over the years that just simply haven't worked. And John and I went back and started doing some research on when was a time in history when the church had a huge impact on the culture. And we had to go all the way back to the early church, the first generation of Christians. And the interesting thing about that is it was illegal to be a Christian. You could, in many cities in the Roman Empire, you could kill a Christian on sight in the street and suffer no consequences for that at all. It's perfectly legal. They were hunted down. They had no money. They had no influence at all. And yet those people completely changed the Western world. I mean, within a remarkably short time, Christianity became the dominant faith in the Western world. And how did it happen? And